All right. Vicky, welcome everyone, and to today's Elliott Advisory Committee meeting. Vicky, do you want to kick us off with a welcome?
Well, I do. I have some notes. Just let me find them real quick.
Maybe while you're doing that, I can go through the agenda if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So agenda for the day is, so we'll have a little bit of time for just general updates if members of the committee have general updates. We have reserved like 45 minutes for talk of the legislative concept. I will say that at one point, including the point when we developed the agenda, we thought we may actually have legislative language to talk through with you all. We don't have that yet. So what we will walk through is the legislative concept that was submitted to Leg Council for drafting. And some of these portions will be review based on the last advisory committee meeting, and some of them will be new since then. So we'll talk through that. I don't think we'll need a full 45 minutes, but we may want a little extra time for the financial modeling, et cetera. So we'll be a little bit flexible on agenda timeline. We have about 45 minutes for forest management planning and an update from the OSU team on that, including the public engagement portion of that. And then, as I said, we have the lion's share of the meeting really oriented towards financial modeling. And the OSU team will be walking through the analysis that they've done, both on long-term sort of sustained cost as well as startup costs. We will have public comment towards the end of the meeting. And again, I want to emphasize that we'll be flexible about the time here. It is scheduled for 11:40 to 11:55. If the meeting moves more efficiently than that, we will save a portion of the last 20 minutes of the meeting, whenever that ends up being, for public comment. And we'll have before we adjourn, we'll have a little bit of time for next steps and talking a little bit about 2022 and what to anticipate there. So that said, as a reminder to folks, members of the public, as per usual in the agreements of this committee, we reserve the conversation during the meeting for members of the advisory committee, and offer an opportunity for public comment towards the end. If you're interested in providing public comment, you can send a chat to either Jenna or I, and we'll make sure to get you in the queue. I will emphasize that we have a number of upcoming public engagement opportunities, including a meeting that the OSU team will talk about next week that's focused on the financial modeling. So there'll be more opportunity for interaction with the team, and we recognize that the 15 minutes is not a lot of time, and so I have scheduled some additional opportunities there. With all of that said, Vicky, can I turn it over to you to
Yeah, I found all my notes. Sorry, I'm discombobulated this morning. I had physical therapy at 7, a color consult at 8 for our living room colors, and then the contractor showed up. So we are doing some remodeling here. It gets a little noisy, so I'll put myself on mute from time to time. I think most of the pounding that drove me nuts got finished yesterday. So anyway, good to see you all. It's pretty awesome. And we're getting into our winter weather, so probably a good thing we're meeting virtually today. It's really great to see you again. I can't tell you how much this means to me to see these meetings and to see your faces and know the work that we're doing. And we've made a lot of progress. The land board had their meeting yesterday, and I gave an update yesterday. So I just want to briefly go over some of those things that I updated them about to help you know what I communicated. The HCP, as you know, we filed that in October. And that's a major milestone. I think the land board was pleased to hear that. We're hoping that the federal agencies sign off on that early next year and we go into the NEPA process. We didn't expect it to take so long, but I think we're within our time frame. So I didn't get any complaints from the land board. I also updated the land board yesterday on other key elements of what we're doing, exploring the suitability of Shutter Creek in North Bend for the forest research use. In fact, tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, it would be Thursday. Yeah, tomorrow's Thursday. There goes my week. Tomorrow, the department and OSU and some other folks are going to be touring the soon to be shuttered Shutter Creek facility. I thought that was a great play on words. I'm looking forward to viewing the site and the potential there. We really have to think about maybe some partners that we might bring in to share the space because it's a pretty large space, but we'll get a better idea about that tomorrow. And then we have a community meeting with community leaders in Coos Bay after that tour. So we'll know more information after that. I also recap for the land board the progress we're making in drafting legislation to establish the public entity and to oversee the forest and also add the decoupling piece in it. The land board understands how critical this legislative piece is. We expect to get the draft back soon. I don't know what my dog has in his mouth. Okay, I just have to be careful. Sometimes he gets pencils and pens. We expect to get that draft back pretty soon to look at internally to see if the drafter is really going the direction we need. And then we'll do a couple of more drafts before we make that available. Treasurer Reen noted yesterday that there are many moving parts to this work, but the enthusiasm of this advisory committee has not dimmed and our momentum is not flagged. So he's really thrilled and thankful. I also want to mention that I appreciate Oregon State's efforts on the moving parts they're working on. The financial analysis and the forest's ability to be self-sustaining are pretty critical to making this project pan out. So, and so is development of the forest management plan. And I believe Tom and his team are going to update you on where they are on that today. We have not forgotten about the need for financial resources to assist us in decoupling and managing this process. I want to tell you that we had a recent meeting. Jeff and I met on December 1st with Matt Strickler, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks, Department of Interior, for the purpose of finding ways to access land water conservation funds for the Elliott State Research Forest Project. Representatives of Fish and Wildlife were on the call, and one of the representatives from U.S. Fish and Wildlife characterized the project as, and I'm going to quote, an outstanding endeavor by the state of Oregon. So that left me with a great big smile on my face in that meeting. All we had to do was give her pom-poms and she would have been our greatest cheerleader. So it was a terrific meeting. They're going to put together a small group of folks from various agencies to look at that, helping us access those funds. And they also committed to reaching out to Robert Bonney, who now is at USDA, but has control over a several $million fund that could make its way out to Oregon, some of it anyway. I do want to let you know that Jason Miner, the governor's policy advisor, natural resources policy advisor, and her land board assistant joined us on that call for the first 10 minutes with the feds and told them how important this project was to the governor. So we were really pleased to hear that. Jeff put together a great slide deck presentation. And after all of that, Matt Strickler said, you know, we're excited about this project and we think it can go places. So we're hoping that enthusiasm leads to further discussions with Interior, USDA, and our federal delegation. So that's where we are on the federal side. So we have not been quiet. As you know, I sent a letter to GSA about the Shutter Creek facility. They sent one back. And after we tour the facility tomorrow, I'll have more answers that I can give to them to clarify some of the things that they asked us to clarify. So I think that does it for my report. And I'm going to kick it back to you, Peter, and put myself on mute and come off when it's necessary, and look forward to the meeting.
Great. Maybe before we move to the next update, we'll see if any committee members have any questions for you on those portions that you just went over, just briefly.
Sure, I can answer to the best of my ability, and if I can't, Jeff can also, and Malia is also on our call. So if you don't have any questions now, don't hesitate to raise them during the meeting at some point.
I do. I just sent you a text, but I'll just go ahead and ask you. Is there an opportunity, or is there an opportunity for any of the rest of us to go on the tour of Shutter Creek?
Yeah. We had sent word out to those of you who wanted to attend. I think Keith is coming, and some local folks. So let us know, Paul.
Okay, I'm interested.
Okay, Malia, would you take note of that and reach out to Paul and provide him with the information about how to attend?
I was actually out there yesterday.
You were? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great view.
Thanks, Paul. And by the way, folks, Keith let me know this morning he had a PUD board meeting that was conflicted with this, so he's tied up, but sends his regards. And with that, Jeff, maybe we'll have you give a brief update on the HCP, and then the team can talk about public engagement. Allie, I'll have you do that, followed by the OSU team about about the financial meeting coming up.
Sure. Short review on the HCP. We have some comments that were given to us by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that ICF is in the process of responding to and making adjustments to the administrative draft and per the requests of the technical review team, and that's going back to the agency late this week or next. And I think the next step that we're waiting for is to determine that the federal agencies are ready to begin the NEPA process. And really the thing of note there is that there will be a public review and comment component to that NEPA process that will be noticed and run by the federal agencies, not by us, but we will be tracking it and make sure that those that are on our mailing list also know about it from us. And that will, I don't have any sense of the calendaring of that right this minute, but as soon as we know something about that public review comment kind of process that the federal agencies will be running, we'll let everyone know.
And Jeff, also during that NEPA process, it's my understanding that consultation with the tribes is required, but we've always been open to consultation with all of the tribes that have been interested and have engaged in that and plan to continue in that. So, but when we do any further consultation, that may involve bringing in the federal agencies in that because it's required under the NEPA. As far as I recall.
Yep, oh, I agree. That's a good add. I think that's it, Peter.
Thanks, Jeff. Allie, do you want to, Allie and or Michael or someone else from the OSU team want to talk about other upcoming public engagement opportunities?
I think the big news here is OSU's financial modeling session next week. So I'll let them speak to that. But I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's engaged with us this year and for 3 years. We've had such great attendance at our public information sessions. Saw so many folks come out in early December when we talked about the legislative concept. Are seeing so many folks at Jeff's drop-ins that he's doing every week. and have just, you guys have all been terrific. So we appreciate everybody's continued interest and participation in this process. DSL believes that when we engage widely and broadly with advisory committees, with stakeholders, with the public, that it leads to better outcomes. And there is no more important spot to have a really fantastic outcome than the Elliott State Research Forest. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you next week. And then we'll see you again in January for more on the legislative concept work. And I'll hand it off to Michael.
I think Paul is going to
Oh,
cover it.
Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll take
hand
it
it off to
today. I don't
Paul.
think Michael's with us. Thank you and good morning. So Tuesday night, the 21st from 5:30 to 7, the public announcement is out. We'll have a public meeting to talk about the financial brief that we're presenting today. We'll go through that information again. It won't be new or different than what you see today. But we want to have this session to allow more time for the public to engage with us and give us more comments as well. We know we have limited time for feedback in this meeting today. So we look forward to making that available and presenting that again and allowing folks to ask more questions and work through details with them as well. Of course, the advisory committee, you're all very welcome to join that meeting, but it won't be new information for you. But of course, you're always welcome to join.
Thanks, Paul. Any other just general updates from the committee? Things that aren't specifically on the agenda, but pertinent to the work of the committee. Okay, all right. Well, with that, we'll turn to the next agenda item. Jeff, I think you're on point to walk through the legislative concept, and then we'll have input from the work group members as needed, as well as, of course, the OSU team and folks who've been engaged in the legislative concept development.
Sure. I think I can probably share screen here. I'm going to put some slides up that reflect what we shared at a public information session earlier this month. I think, as Peter said, got up on the screen? All right. I think, as Peter said, we don't have a legislative, we don't have the first draft of a bill to share with you today, and I haven't seen anything. So I would tell you what I knew if I had taken a look and had any new information beyond what I'm going to show you today. So a lot of this is review of things you've seen before. But what I want to say mostly is that those of you that have been participating on the Legislative Concept Working Group, I'd love it if you would step in and give your perspective on some of these slides so that folks can hear directly from you about the conversation or your thinking that went into what the language is that's on the screen. So this is our process. We did submit the bill, we did submit the legislative concept, and it was a real thorough job on some really, on some of the items that will eventually be in the bill that probably would have tripped us up if we had not been so thorough in the work that the working group did to get ready to submit the concept. So I think we're going to be in good shape when we get something back. We know we will have something back by early January. It might happen sooner. We might even get a chance to have a little bit of back and forth before the final bill draft has to be submitted on the 14th of January. My big message today is that we have one more of these advisory committee meetings before the legislative session starts. So the working group is going to be working with us on whatever timeline we have once Legislative Council engages us. But we will be back in front of the full committee on the 18th to talk about exactly what it is that we've got and how it's expected to go through the session. When I'm done, Malia can talk to you a little bit. She's been meeting with OSU and Treasurer's Office and Governor's Office on legislative process and outreach kind of plans. So she'll talk to you some about that. And that's probably a little more important than what I'm going to go through. Three big pieces, though: establishing the independent public entity. And we talked a lot about oversight responsibilities and then the public accountability. The new entity piece, it's real important. I think we have all landed after a lot of discussion that this is not going to be a public corporation. It's going to be a public entity or an agency. It's not going to be, the Elliott's not going to be subsumed or put into an existing agency and managed under the umbrella of an existing state agency. So this legislation will create, it's the enabling legislation that will create a new entity, most likely called the Elliott State Research Forest Authority. And that authority would be responsible for the forest. And we have some ties to the State Land Board that have been retained, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. The entity will be overseen by a board of directors. And while it won't be part of an existing agency, we are making sure that it'll have all the authorities and the permissions necessary for it to contract or agree with other agencies to provide services, so that it doesn't have to, all the components of a new agency won't have to be stood up at once. And so that will be very helpful in streamlining things. Members of the working group, any additions that you might like to add based on the conversations you all had around the new entity piece of this? All right. Jump in if you do. We talked at
Jeff,
yes.
can you remind us all who was on the working group?
Sure. Paul Beck, Melissa Cribbins, Keith, and Bob Salinger and Mark Stern. I don't think I missed anybody there. Did I, Peter?
Nope, you got it.
I got it. So one thing that was discussed was having both an overarching mission statement and then several statements of purpose that are more specific on establishing why the research authority is being established. This is the overarching mission statement, which I think has not changed since we met last. And we'll make this deck available for everybody. I know there are a lot of words here. These are the 11 statements of purpose that the working group worked on. I think that the key thing that if Keith were here, he'd ask me to say, or he would say himself, is that these didn't just come out of thin air. These were pulled generally by work that the advisory committee did on guiding principles back in 2019 and from the OSU proposal that was submitted to the land board in 2020. So while the words may have been moved around a little bit or broken out differently, we tried very hard not to bring anything new, whole cloth into the context of the statements of purpose. If there are a couple of pieces of the legislation when we get a bill draft back to us that I expect to be the same, it's the mission statement and these statements of purpose. I think they'll be either identical or very close because we spent a lot of time working through that. One change that I think was made since the last advisory committee meeting was the number 7. We did talk to our tribal representatives on at least 2 of the 3 that are on the advisory committee and got some suggestions on tweaking the language around partnerships for the tribal governments to be both research and demonstration of traditional and contemporary tribal cultural practices. Otherwise, there hasn't been a lot of change or adjustment to this, a few tweaks here and there since we last met. Working group members, anything to say about the statements of purpose? All right.
I love number 7. That's really awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited about the potential there, and I think everyone's excited about the potential there. On oversight, again, a lot of words, so you'll want to take a look at this, but this is the essence of how the authority will function or be overseen. A board of directors is responsible for the oversight and operation of the authority and responsible for meeting the mission objectives, those statements of purpose and the mission objectives of it being a forest for research, and working with OSU to implement the operations. There's a number of things that will define the relationship between OSU and the research or in the board of directors that were discussed, and will probably be shaped and formed as that board gets underway. And I'll give Paul and Tom a chance to jump in there and say anything you want to about that. But you can see that the board of directors is really the ultimately responsible for the new authority and for the forest, and making sure that it follows the mission and the whole reason we're setting this up. It approves budgets, biennial operation plans and reports, recreation plans, any amendments to the forest management plan, things like that all come within the purview of the board. The executive director.
Jeff,
Yes.
before you go on, I was hoping in there you would have a point about how the board is appointed. Does that come up later?
That does. There's a slide coming up.
Okay, great.
Because we spent about as much time talking about how to appoint the board as we did on what the board would do.
I have that recollection as well. Thanks.
Not surprising, right? The board hires the executive director, but there's a lot of interwoven connections between contemplated between OSU and the board in the hiring process and the way that executive director will function in relationship to the board. Some of it or all of it is undoubtedly not going to make it into legislation, but we've left the board with a lot of the authority that's needed to kind of shape a relationship that's going to work for the forest and work for OSU's and being ensured that they've got the capacity to implement their research program. So that's what I'm going to say about the board of directors and executive director without going through every bullet. Paul, Tom, members of the working group, you want to chime in on the relationship here between these two pieces? That'd be a great time. Everybody good?
Yeah, I think you described it well, Jeff. I think the way you said, we struggled a bit with the language around exactly what that looks like in terms of the hiring process. I like the way you said it's going to be an interwoven process, because this person is going to be responsible for OSU employees. They need to be engaged with OSU at the same time. And so getting that language right and getting that so that it works for OSU and works for the board and the entity is going to be key. And hopefully the drafters see a way forward in that makes sense.
Thanks,
Paul?
Tom. Paul, Beck?
Yeah. I'm not sure that maybe it changed, but I thought the ED was going to be hired by the board, but actually be a contract position with OSU. Is that changed?
That's one of those places that we in the legislation may not direct that, but the board's going to have the authority to do that. And so we'll see what the first cut at the language is out to. There's not any intention to prevent that. It was a matter of whether the legislation was going to explicitly mandate it or could. So we'll see what the nuance of the wording is when we get the next draft.
Hey, Jeff, this is Bob. I can't see the slide, but can you talk a little bit about the tiebacks to the land board, or is that in a future slide?
I will. I think that's where we're going next.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, were you wanting to continue that thread? No? Okay.
Yeah, Paul, Tom, or Katie Fast, anything else? Paul Odenthal, excuse me.
Yeah, no, and I think, Jeff's on track, and there is that important part we talked about, right? The ED needs to be tied to the research, which really is, through OSU to be able to recruit the right type of individual we need for this as well. So I think, again, perhaps that's too much detail for the legislation, but it is an important piece of this as we go forward and to manage the relationship and that tie. And we spent a lot of time on the executive director position and how we make the proper ties to give the board independence and ensure that OSU has what it needs to be successful in the research mission.
Yeah, I saw a lot of congruency in the way the working group members were viewing that in OSU. Just that was my observation. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about the initial board, but the initial board will be comprised of members of the advisory committee. And so we see some continuity, that there's not just going to be a break where somebody wasn't involved in these discussions and comes in fresh, I think. And that helps us feel a little more comfortable about carrying this forward. For the board of directors composition, where the working group has landed is a direct appointment by the state land board, and it would not be a Senate confirmation. And there was a lot of discussion, just as a point of reference for the advisory committee members, about whether there should be a designated seat for particular interests to somehow establish a balance on the board from the outset. And tentatively, where everything sits today is the language you see on the screen on that second bullet under appointment. I'll read it. The land board shall consult with the board of directors in OSU and endeavor to appoint members with a balance of interests, experience, and expertise related to the purposes and operations of the Elliott State Forest, as well as a demonstrable interest in the success of the stated mission of the forest. So the language is broad, but directive to the land board on the appointment of the kind of future membership we want to see. 7 or 9 members to give flexibility for the future, plus the dean being designated in statute as a non-voting ex officio member on an ongoing basis. And I got questions on this at the public meeting sessions early in December. We weren't thoroughly consistent and definitive about the terms of service, but generally what we put into legislative council was have staggered terms, basically consistent with what other natural resource board, the terms are for other natural resources boards that are appointed and for state agencies. We discussed 3 to 4 years with the possibility of renewal. So I could still consider that to be not finally resolved, but it's still on the agenda for the working group to sign off on. But it'll be something in that range probably. Initial board of directors comes from a slate of candidates that are developed by this committee and OSU and Vicky and submitted to the land board. And we expect that and want to see a fair amount of continuity between this group and an initial board of directors that will be there to kind of get things started. Bob asked about the state land board. We have retained ties back to the land board, and it's on a couple of things. The expectation is there that every 2 years, the state land board will receive what's called a biennial programmatic review. It'll be a written review submitted to the land board by the board of directors saying how things are going. And that'll be received at a public meeting of the land board. For the first 6 years, I think the working group landed that there would be an annual operations performance report that would be submitted. So the land board would be hearing how things are going every year for the first 6 years, and on an ongoing basis by statute requirement to have a programmatic review in front for discussion by the land board every other year. The purpose and the framing of the land board's oversight is to provide input and policy guidance to the board of directors on how the implementation of the authority is going in relationship to the OSU proposal that the land board reviewed and accepted in December of 2020 and current state policies that may be in place. The land board will have review and approval authority in the legislation stating that if the forest management plan has to be approved by the land board and any revisions or amendments or updates need to go in front of the forest management plan will go in front of the land board. If there are any proposed revisions or amendments to the habitat conservation plan, that will have to go to the land board for review and approval. And if there's going to be any expansion of the forest or swaps or reductions in acreage related to the forest, that also would specifically in legislation be required to go to the land board. otherwise, the land board's relationship to the board of directors and the forest is more a policy guidance, and there, if things get high centered and either the board or OSU request the land board to come in and engage in helping sort something out. How'd I do, Bob? Paul, any additions, thoughts on that? Okay.
Eric, Tom, you have a question?
A quick question. So, I'm sure a lot of time went into discussion on keeping the land board involved with this. My concern is that's a highly political organization that's going to be responsible for a science project and with a lot of competing views across the state. So I'll just throw that out there. My big question is, they're responsible for the direct appointments. Can they also fire a advisory or a board of director or reappoint a new director, or once they get that term, are they in place for that 3 to 4 year period? Has anybody considered that?
It was talked about in great detail. This was a compromise. There are folks like you and me that fear that political appointments will be made, and folks in rural Oregon will get left out. But we think we've got enough language in there that will nudge them the right way in their choices that they make.
Just use my experience with the Port of Coos Bay. We're governor appointed, Senate confirmed positions. And we've got a good balanced board that represents the area, but you are under the kind of continual threat that if you're kind of not towing the line, you could potentially be replaced. So that would be a concern as these people get selected, that there's some mechanism that, unless they've done something negligent or, some sort of bad behavior, that there isn't going to be a lot of political maneuvering, to replace people if they, and it could go both directions. I mean, you could get somebody that you think is pro-industry and all of a sudden they take a much more environmental bend, and,
The pushback to that, Eric, is everything else that's in this document that tells us how the Elliott's going to be managed. There isn't a lot of decision space for a board member to make. There's purpose, there's mission statement, there's the HCP. Those are going to be the guiding documents, and any decision that a board makes is going to have to fit within that guidance.
Know me, I'm always the skeptic, but cautiously optimistic.
And I think
you and me both.
And I think the forest management plan also, Paul,
Yes.
is one to mention as well, which has a longevity that will arc beyond the term of any individual board member.
I'd like to say that, Eric, I really appreciate your sentiment on the research. We actually talked about that a lot, about how do we ensure that the long-term research mission of the forest is ensured with this with this entity, if it's being governed by a body that doesn't specifically understand or appreciate the research objectives, and it could cease to exist. And so we tried to weave that into the language of the legislative concept that you must fulfill the mission, the research mission of the forest. That is the objective of the entity. And I don't know if it's strong enough, actually, but I really appreciate your input. And it's something that we need to be vigilant about, because there's so many examples of good intent on long-term research objectives that then go sideways when decisions are made about, well, we don't want to put money into this anymore, or we don't want to, we don't like the direction this is going, so it's going to be moved off to something else. And so we tried to get the language right. Not sure we did, but I just wanted to emphasize that we did talk about that a lot, and I really appreciate your thoughts on that because I'm concerned about it as well. Thanks, Eric.
Probably be that 70-year-old guy that comes to the meetings, years from now and says, this isn't how we talked about doing it, and whether or not anybody will listen, who knows, but.
I want to also add that, Eric, you're right. These appointments are always political, no matter where they are. And that's just the nature of these kinds of things. And political is not necessarily party. It's just political because people want their representatives of their interest groups to be on these kinds of boards. And that's fine. That's the whole process. My expectation, it's not listed here, but my expectation is when the land board looks at direct appointments of these members, that they're going to have to fill out an interest form like they do for Senate confirmed appointments. So you'll be able to see what background people have, whether there's a science background or a timber background or anything like that. So that should be helpful in trying to get a rounded membership on the board.
Yeah, and we did have discussion, and there's not going to be anything that would preclude the board of directors from making recommendations on the kind of expertise and gaps that need to be filled in order to have a functioning working board that fulfills the goals of the forest and OSU and others as well. So I think that this is one of those places where the legislation probably will have a lot of room for implementation to be nuanced in order to do the right thing, or at least help feel more comfortable that the right process is going to be the one that's done by the land board.
I think the most important part of this is the fact that this group will make recommendations on who that board is. You can have a forestry background, but it may not be relevant. It may not be relevant forestry background. You could be a retired career person from the Forest Service, and that would not be relevant to a state forest or a research forest or forest practices in the state of Oregon. So I think the most important thing is that we're going to be able to advise the land board on who they need to appoint. And I think that's critical.
Yep, and getting off to a really strong start with the first board.
Yep.
Was there any conversation about the existing board, after the initial board is put together, that they are the group that puts a slate together for the land board rather than the public just signing up like you do for every other commission?
It's in there.
Okay.
Land board's required to consult with the board of directors and OSU on the appointments.
So consulting with them and getting the slate from the existing board would be two different things. If you have to, if I get you give it to me, okay, thanks, round file, or here's the list. We've already whittled down the top 10, but based on our experience, these are the people, in this group that we've already kind of weeded it out. I don't know if that's overly self-serving or not, but
I think beyond saying these are our recommendations, beyond that would be us appointing them, and that isn't going to fly.
Shall I, Colin?
So I think the legislative concept is very well thought out, and I'm really eager to see the draft legislation itself. I think the nuances and details of the wording and the actual legislation will be really important. And I'm wondering, I saw in the timeline earlier that the final legislation would be delivered to the committee on the 14th of next month, with the legislative session beginning February 1st. And I think that's a really short timeline for us to be able to review the legislation itself. And I'm wondering if it's possible for us to get a draft copy to look at before that January 14th date.
We will be absolutely, the working group will be on a very quick turnaround time and have things as we get them. The opportunities there for any of the advisory committee members that want to plug in and be, really up to speed and real time. We're happy to work with folks on that. The point of the spear for the advisory committee right now is the legislative concept working group, and they will be on a quick turnaround. As soon as we get things that we can from legislative council in a bill draft form, then it won't be 24 hours before we're talking to folks. It's just kind of the way the process works on a short session.
Okay. And do you have an update from legislative council on when they might be able to have a draft ready for review?
I don't. I know that they're being really collaborative in terms of calling up the Department of Justice or Malia and asking questions if they've got them, but I don't know when we're going to be able to give you language.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Bob Salinger.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo all of that too. I mean, I think, we all need to be prepared just for probably the first draft coming back from Ledge Council. I know I said this is another meeting too, to be a bit of a train wreck. They usually are. So usually you get that thing kind of go, oh my God. And then we're going to have to be doing a ton of work in a very short amount of time. And then that first week of the legislative session is going to be really critical. It'll probably be over one way or another at the end of the first or second week. So it's just going to be a frantic timeline, but that's the nature of the session, as Jeff said. So I think we just need to be really ready for that. It's going to be a lot of work in a very condensed period.
And this maybe fast forwards into next steps, but we'll certainly be scheduling times for that work group to meet very early in January, so they can expect doodle requests coming out soon, and anybody else from the advisory committee that's interested in engaging more directly in that, just shoot me an email and we'll make sure to get you included.
And I really would encourage people not to sort of stress too much when they see that first draft. I know among our circles, when we get it back, usually there is kind of this freak out of, oh my God, look at this thing, but that is the nature of it often.
Yes, it is. And it's amazing how quickly you can bring things back into line and move forward when you have to. And that's usually what happens. So we'll get it done.
Thanks, Jeff. Anything else that you need to cover on this? And also any additional comments or questions from the advisory committee?
No, I think that's the main piece. I think we could stop there and be comfortable. I'll make sure the deck is available for folks. And as always, I'm here if you've got questions or want more input.
Great. Thanks for the good conversation, the meaningful work from the working group that helped to develop the concept, and for the continued engagement of the committee and the work going forward, and to ensure that the actual legislation meets all of your diverse interests. That said, I think we are ready to have Shannon talk about the ongoing work in the forest management plan development, as well as sort of the work that's happening, the work that's anticipated in 2022, and as well as the public engagement opportunities.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
You know what, Shannon? I missed something. Malia was going to give a brief, I think Malia, Katie Fast, and we had anticipated maybe Ryan Mann being here, but I think Malia and Katie will give a brief update on legislative outreach.
I was gonna kind of jump in there because I think we've almost sort of organically got there as we were talking about the legislative concept. And so just really briefly to piggyback on everything that Jeff and Bob Salinger pointed out, first of all, I want to thank again the group that's been working to develop the legislative concept. It's been a lot of work for the last couple of months, and as you saw a little bit through the slides that Jeff put together, while it is a relatively narrow concept compared to all of the elements that are going into establishing a research forest, it's going to be a pretty comprehensive legislative concept and bill that needs to be moved forward. And so I think we've covered a lot of ground there. Became apparent to us in late October, early November, as the advisory committee subgroup was working on those legislative guidelines, that we really needed to be having an LC drafted. And so I think at this point, everyone knows, we did reach out to Senator Beyer just to get a note down to LC to get that drafting process started. So we are working with a drafter. And as Jeff said, they're being really responsive and collaborative. I know that they're working away and checking in with us for clarifications and questions. There isn't a draft available yet from LC, but we hope to have that available for the larger group to review, to edit, and to be able to turn around in January. The deadline to actually drop the bill for February session is January 14th. And so when this group meets again on January 18th, we will certainly have what won't be an LC at that time. We'll have the actual bill that will be going through the process. The plan is to have the draft, though, go through the advisory committee. And as Bob said, and I agree, I have never once seen a first draft come out of LC that is like, yep, that's what we wanted, ready to go, it's going to be dropped. So the plan is certainly to get a draft, have it reviewed, have some edits done, turn it back around, and then have a draft that is ready to be dropped by January 14th. So, during that January timeline, we'll definitely be reaching out to advisory committee members and ramping up the outreach, not just to legislators, but to local communities and interest groups that you're in touch with, et cetera, to be talking about that bill, all of that it entails, because as Bob indicated, the February session is like grease lightning. It is almost over by the time it starts. And so when day one comes, we need everyone to understand what's in the bill, why it's written that way, and what we're trying to achieve there. So at this point, we are working with LC, but we're still doing a little bit of outreach to members in both chambers because we don't know where the bill will go. And by January 18th, when we meet again, certainly I think we'll have a better idea, but I will say that there are no knowns until a referral actually happens. And so I think that's what we know as far as the process right now. Katie, am I missing anything there that you want to add to this?
No, I don't think so, Malia. I think the only thing is, just as Malia said, it's a 35-day session. So this is going to move really quick. And I recognize that there's not a lot of time to review the drafts, but I just need to stress, like, when Peter or whoever sends out the draft, we are going to have really short deadlines from LC to get that back so it can be ready to be dropped on the 14th. So fortunately, the process doesn't give a lot of time for that review. So when you get those, please take the time to look through it.
No, that's well said. And I will on behalf of all of the project team, I'll just ask for your forgiveness in advance. And as folks have pointed out, we may be sending you drafts and saying, hey, we need this back by the end of the day. And it may be a 20 or 30 page draft. And so we're going to do our best not to put you in those situations, but please understand that the timeline is not ours. And so I see Mark, I see you have your hand up, and then Jeff too.
Yeah, thanks, Malia. Maybe a question for you and or Katie, but you mentioned when the bill will get referred. I'm just curious, or maybe I don't know, who actually refers the bill? Does that come from DSL?
No, so that's a great question. So procedurally in the legislature, the Senate bills go to the Senate president, the House bills go to the Speaker of the House, and the Senate president refers the Senate bills to whatever Senate committees he deems them to be appropriate. And then the House Speaker does the same on the House side. So at this point, we have a Senate request for the LC. And so we're certainly talking to folks on the Senate side, but as many of you know who are already doing a little bit of outreach, we're certainly talking to folks on the House side as well.
And so then would the land board or DSL decide if it stays with the Senate, or where's that is that between the Senate president and the Speaker of the House?
Yeah, essentially what happens is each member is allowed to request a certain number of bills. And so for short sessions, essentially every senator and every representative are allowed to drop 2 personal bills. If you are the chair of a committee, your committee is also allowed to drop 3 bills. So in this case, we have a request that was put in by Lee Byer for one of his personal bills. So that would become a Senate bill. However, as you know, bills have to, one way or the other, go through both chambers, whether that's going across the Senate side and then the House committee, or if it goes down to Ways and Means, which is a joint committee, that's considered going through both of the committee sides, and then it has to go across both floors. So even if it comes out the Senate side, the House work will be important as well.
Great, thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
You know, the other piece I would just add is, because you asked about committee, Mark, I would expect that the bill will likely have a hearing the first week of the session, if not the start of the second week. So that first week in February, I would expect to see a hearing on the bill, because while we haven't got the deadlines for bills to move, they normally need to move by the second week of the session. So it will move really quickly once we get in there as well.
Thanks.
Stay tuned for details. Jeff, one more quick.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Malia, did you have something else?
No, I saw Jeff's hand go down, but I knew that he had it up initially. So.
Yep.
Just one more point that we haven't talked about in the context of legislation. There is every expectation that we will be moving forward with a funding component for decoupling in the February session as well. So we didn't mention that in this whole conversation, but that is integral to the legislative strategy and the discussions that are happening now.
Thanks, Jeff. And I see Mary nodding her head about it being integral.
So Peter, can I just say one more thing? And this is just to reiterate this, because I don't think, for those of you who haven't been through, especially a short session, to just prepare you really for the pace that's coming. So I would just encourage you all to have a happy and restful holiday, because the pace in January and February is going to be, and I say this as optimistically as possible, absolutely brutal. So thanks, and looking forward to working with you over the next 10 weeks.
Thanks, Malia. Thanks, Katie. With that, why don't we restart, Shannon, my apologies, the conversation about the forest management plan. And after Shannon is done with her overview and we've had some conversation about that, I'll make sure to get folks a break. So there's a break coming. In the meantime, feel free to step away as needed.
Great, thanks, Peter. Okay, let me pull this up again. Okay, so today we wanted to do an overview of the forest management plan scope and timeline. And for those of you who were part of the FMP working group meeting earlier this month, this is going to look very familiar. We added a couple of specific details on an example that we're using to walk through this process, and also really had a great discussion with the FMP working group members and got some great feedback that we're working into our draft table of contents and plans moving forward. So this is the draft timeline that we shared with the steps in the FMP development process as we've outlined them to date. And we'll talk today more about the intersection of this timeline with the FMP engagement plan. Obviously, you can't read the details of this, but there is a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet with this draft timeline that has been shared and has all of the details. The pieces that I wanted to look at here with you today are that there are color-coded workflows going along the bottom of this, this timeline and this development process, and they're all running alongside each other. And in many cases, a result from one step in this process is going to feed into a different step, either within this same line or related to any of these other lines, or help refine another piece. And so there's sort of a stepwise process happening, as well as a feedback with many of these details up here in the spreadsheet of how all of these steps are fitting together as we work on this forest management plan. And this is just a zoomed in view of that timeline at the bottom. And so you can see that the major workflow areas that we're categorizing are data collection, analysis, and management. We have some modeling work, and we've had presentations in the working group meetings from several people who OSU is working with at the University of Oregon to come and do some landscape modeling with us. We are also incorporating other models and similar work here as part of this process. There's an experimental design and key research projects piece, which we'll talk a little bit more about today as well. A lot of these steps feeding into the landscape analysis and adaptive management strategy that will be part of the forest management plan. There, of course, is a monitoring piece, and this is really a key part of the long-term research plan, as well as looking at what we need to do in this next year as part of the forest management plan and as part of collecting some more baseline information about the forest. You can see the habitat conservation plan is here, continuing to engage in that process and incorporate the HCP into the forest management plan document, as well as the broader conservation strategy. So including not just species that are specifically listed in the HCP, but an overall conservation strategy. We have a financial section here that's part of the forest management plan. As we discussed with the working group earlier this month, you'll see that right now, this piece looks like it's not starting until July 2022, but we're actually going to be talking about the financial analysis that has been done so far today. And we'll be continuing to bring in new information to that analysis and update it. The reason that this is starting right here in our forest management plan timeline is that at this point, we expect to have more details that would really help us refine that analysis, although we will be continuing to work on it prior to this. And then along the bottom here, you can see drafting FMP sections beginning now and continuing through the end of the process. You'll see here that there's December 2022, and then there's a little bit of a break. So the plan from the beginning for this forest management plan was a total of 2 years to complete, which is a pretty quick timeline given all of the information and the input and feedback that we need to incorporate. But we also know that December 2022 is an important milestone for this forest management plan. And so what we're working on with this timeline is bringing together existing information, new information, input from working groups, from stakeholders, from the public, and targeting a list of key parts of the draft that we will work on for November 2022 that would then be ready to present to the State Land Board in December 2022. Understanding that based on our timeline, we'll then be continuing to refine some of those sections through September 2023. And so that's why you see this little break here, but that's how we're parsing out the important information that we need to have for December 2022, as well as the additional analysis that we're expecting to have as part of this forest management plan. And we've gotten some feedback from the F&P working group about what some of those key sections are and the information that they feel is important for us to have included in that draft at this point in December. So keeping this draft development timeline in mind, today we'd like to walk through an example of how the steps in this timeline fit together in this F&P scope of work to create the forest management plan. So first, a reminder of the big picture, because we've been talking about a lot of different details in our last few meetings. I just wanted to zoom us back out to the triad experimental design that's outlined in the approved research proposal that really is a foundation for the research platform and the Elliott State Research Forest. The F&P will detail how the Elliott will achieve the objectives outlined in the research proposal, including how decisions will be made and what management strategies will be used to sustainably manage the forest and achieve that research vision that was approved by the Land Board in December 2020. So just a very brief overview, because I know we've looked at these maps and documents before. The triad experimental design for the Elliott consists of a couple of different components. You'll see right here in the dark green, the conservation research watersheds. This area is approximately 34,000 acres of contiguous reserve, and it would be the largest reserve of that type, a contiguous reserve in the Oregon Coast Range, and it represents about 41% of the Elliott's land base. Looking over here, we have a bunch of different colors. This is the management research watersheds, and this is a mixture of reserves with intensive forestry in the light green, extensive in the orange, and then a combination of reserves, ecological forestry, and intensive, the triad I and triad E, in these pink and blue. And you can see the breakdown here. And these are directly pulled from the research proposal, which has all of the details about this design and the work that went into it. And so looking at just a breakdown of the forest, we have approximately 67% of the forest in reserves and riparian conservation areas between the conservation research watersheds and the management research watersheds, about 17% in intensive and 16% in extensive. And within the riparian areas, about 86% of non-fish bearing and fish bearing streams from the headwalls down to the streams are in protected status. So now that we're in the forest management plan development stage, we are reviewing and adjusting some of the treatment allocations at the stand level based on additional criteria and data than what was used in the first analysis for the research proposal. And so this allows us to refine the assignments to the triad treatments and the associated forest management activities, as well as really dig into the management strategies and decision-making guidelines that would be part of the Elliott. And so this is a look at some of the high-level steps that we're working on as part of the forest management plan to do this fine scale tuning. It includes an updated inventory and ecological data. We have existing data that we are continuing to incorporate, including digitizing maps. We are planning activities for a 2022 field season. As has been mentioned at other meetings, we have LiDAR data from summer 2021 that we're anticipating being able to look at soon. And once we have that data, we'll be digging into the analysis there. And that'll give us an updated snapshot of what's happening on the forest. and some really key data for us to use in our analysis as part of the forest management plan. And we'll dig into that process a little bit more in a couple of slides. We are also working on additional stakeholder and partner input, and this includes addressing feedback from the conservation community about specific watersheds that they have input on, working with local partners, including watershed councils, inputs on various areas that members of this advisory committee meeting and other stakeholders would like us to take a closer look at as part of our analysis with the additional criteria we're bringing in, as well as continuing to bring in local experts and other partners and stakeholders, including forest managers and research forest directors. We are consulting on the best way to work collaboratively with a broad range of groups. We're bringing in social scientists and have had some really great conversations with several researchers on that. And so we're working on how to bring in this collaborative process, not only in the development phase of the forest management plan, continuing that from the research proposal, but also in the overall research mission and work of the Elliott. We're also,
Shannon?
yes.
Sorry, I noticed Ken McCall's got his hand up with a.
Oh, sorry, Ken, I didn't see you.
Oh, that's okay, Shannon. It's, I'm do my best to be invisible most of the time. I was wondering, being a former Siuslaw person, is there any tie in our wording in our research studies to the adjacent Siuslaw National Forest Devil's Staircase Wilderness Area, which is a very similar size to the reserve we have here on the Elliott? So that's one half of the question in terms of the forest management piece. But my question goes more directly to a tie with the HCP, particularly with the two avian species we have under consideration there. You know, some sort of a tie with that other large block of unmanaged, which is the big difference between our reserve and Siuslaw's wilderness areas. There's no management at all in the wilderness piece, whereas we do have management, you know, over time to advance our reserve area more toward that ancient forest, old forest. So if you could give me a tip on that, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure. On the question of the Siuslaw and how that's been incorporated so far with the research proposal, I might ask Katie if she has any insights on that, since she was really heavily involved in that part of the process. To your second question, and I just want to make sure I understand it, you're talking about the marbled murrelets and northern spotted owls in the HCP and sort of how those species fit into the research and management strategy?
Well, more is there a consideration of that additional block of, you know, the adjacency is essentially the width of the river there. I mean, it's directly to the northeast of our block of reserve. So have we spoken at all to the opportunity, if you will, that those two avian species have to use both blocks almost simultaneously? And I think that probably the same thing applies to the coastal coho. That you know, there's quite a riparian system there also on the Siuslaw adjacent. So if that makes sense, give it a shot. If it doesn't, we can talk offline sometime.
Yeah, that's a great question. On the coho question, so I would say the short answer is yes, we're looking at local partnerships and sort of the landscape scale. And I know specifically on the coho question, we've been interacting with the local watershed council in that area and the Coos Basin Coho Partnership, which is newly forming. And so we're looking at a broader landscape scale with them at some of the activities and the research and monitoring that they're doing and sort of how that dovetails with the Elliott. So that includes sort of an overlap of our two areas. And those are some of the conversations that we really want to dig into with some of our local stakeholders and partners to just sort of align what's happening in the area beyond the borders of the Elliott. Beyond that, Katie, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add about the Sayusla in particular.
Well,
And if not, I can follow up with you, Ken.
yeah, I just one quick thing is Ken, in the proposal, we have acknowledged the existence of the Devil's Staircase, and we actually have some maps in our proposal that show just what you just said, how closely these are, and how it does make a contiguous area of where conservation is the emphasis. Different approaches, you're right, but that it's definitely part of it. And also in the HCP process, when there were owl circles that overlapped, that's where it came into play in terms of the into the relative habitat quality within those circles. So if a circle did happen to cross the river into the Devil's Staircase, then that's where it would come into play. But it's not seen as a replacement. So it's like we can do this down here because we have that up there. It's more additive in the viewpoint of the proposal, and I think in the HCP. So hope that answers your questions.
It does. Thanks, Katie. And that is the word I really wanted to hear, is the additive part. That it's just such a neat piece of landscape that adds to the landscape that we're dealing with here. So thank you both.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
All right, and Katie and Shannon, you can continue on.
Okay. So another piece of this is continuing to work with Indigenous communities to ensure that appropriate care is taken to avoid culturally significant areas and spiritual places. And we are reaching out in consultation as part of our engagement plan as well. And the final bullet point here is the landscape analysis. So this involves analyzing and incorporating updated data, as well as additional analysis and input from researchers, working groups, including some science working groups that we're putting together, and individuals with forest management expertise, as well as those with local expertise. And so the ultimate goal is research and management that's tailored to the landscape, not imposed on the landscape. And so that is the overarching vision and context of the experimental design in the approved research proposal. And in order to develop a refined treatment allocation and detailed strategies to support the research management of the Elliott in the forest management plan, we're now integrating that additional data and criteria. And so what we'd like to do today is use an example of a sub-watershed and sort of walk through what this process looks like as it's outlined in that, that timeline that we shared. And so this uses an example of a sub-watershed that is a triad I allocation. And so it's a complex mixture of intensive, extensive reserves and riparian conservation areas. And so you'll see intensive here in the light green, reserve in the red, extensive in orange, and the riparian conservation areas here in the blue. A few key pieces to focus on here. There are a range of treatments and silvicultural practices happening across this watershed, which is a total of 530 acres. And these activities, the research and management activities, are happening over a long time period. And so if we're looking at this example, the full range is over a course of about 80 years. And I just wanted to point out that these are all approximate years. These are estimates based on our first analysis as part of the research proposal. We're going to be continuing to refine these allocations, but also, you know, these may not be the exact years that that a regeneration harvest, for example, would happen in this intensive area. They're more the guidelines right now, according to the research proposal that's been laid out in our analysis. And really, it's based on the planned rotation. So for intensive, that's 60 years. And for extensive, that's about 120, 125 years. And there may be intermediate stand treatments such as thinning in the intensive and extensive treatments in between. And so the timing of the forest operations is staggered depending on the treatment allocation and depending on the current stand age. So you can see here, with this intensive area up here is currently 37 years old. And so according to the research design, this would have a regeneration harvest in 2044 up here, whereas this area down here is currently 11 years old and would have a planned regeneration harvest in 2069. So you can see the sort of stepwise management scheme for just this one watershed. And there's another one for 2040. So this view shows the layering of another set of data and criteria for analysis. So you can see that overlaid on the information that I just shared, we have some additional data on stand age, which is the crosshatch going this way. This is stand age greater than 65, and a crosshatch going the other way on marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl habitat. And so this is the data that we currently have. We know that there are some updates that need to be made to this. And so this is one piece of the analysis that we're going through is sort of ground truthing this data and making sure that these habitat designations or these areas that have been designated as habitat for either northern spotted owl or marbled murrelet are accurate so that we're working off the best available data. You'll see stand 1866 up here is an extensive. This is right next to a reserve area. And this is about 40 acres. And according to the research design, this is an 80% retention area. And so this is from the first pass. As I said, the first analysis is part of the research proposal. This area was assigned to this extensive with 80% retention because of its age. And now we're at the stage where we're applying some additional data and criteria to determine if that initial allocation makes sense. So there are a couple of questions that we might ask here. Does this area become a part of the 500-acre 80% retention experiment for marbled murrelet habitat that's outlined in the research proposal? Do the stand boundaries make sense, or are there adjustments that need to be made based on things like topography, operations, road location and quality, stand structure and habitat characteristics? Should some or all of this area be moved to a different treatment allocation? And then what effect does that have on the rest of the watershed and the landscape scale when those changes are made? And similarly, we can apply a process for this stand 1861 over here, this reserve area, and look at the potential for fragmentation and how this area here at the edge of this subwatershed relates to the adjacent subwatersheds. And so this is what we're looking at now is refining this analysis based on that additional data and criteria, and then looking again at the landscape scale about how any changes that are made affect the whole picture. And I should reiterate, this is under the research proposal. So we're not proposing drastic changes. We're doing fine scale refinement. And Paul, I see your hand up.
Yeah, that 40 acres that's got 80% retention. I know I know others will ask, how long is that retained for? It isn't forever. That isn't the intention, I wouldn't think.
So that retention harvest is that 120, 125 year rotation. So at that point, that's when that 80% retention would sort of happen on that rotation timescale, with the potential for some thinnings in between, if that answers your question.
So you're locking in the prescription forever. So the next entry that might take 80% out, or you know, whatever, or any amount out, would be 120 years down the road.
That's what's outlined in the research proposal, those rotation lengths for for the regeneration harvests, with then the potential for those intermediate harvests. And those are some of the details that the forest management plan is really going to be digging into.
That's a big one.
I appreciate that feedback.
Thanks, Shannon. I'll have you just with an eye towards the clock. We'll have you keep clicking here.
Okay. And Paul, we can follow up on that conversation as well, because that is a piece of what we're working on for the forest management plan. So just being cognizant of time, I wanted to look at some additional data, the type of additional data that we might bring in as part of this analysis. And this is data from a series of maps that was just recently digitized. And so we have a new view of what's happening in this watershed. So this is the same watershed. And you can see right here that there was a stand management sale in 1971 that is now overlaid on this landscape. And you can see that it covers the area that we have designated for intensive, extensive, and reserve. And so we have this additional data that we can use to get a better understanding of the history of these stands and to make those decisions that I was talking about on the last slide. And so looking at how we get through this process that's outlined in the timeline, I wanted to look at those different workflows that we spoke about at the beginning. And so first, to start with data collection and analysis, this includes gathering existing data sets in our new database management system. As we discussed in previous meetings, we have that updated LiDAR. We are working on updating maps, including digitizing maps of past stand management sales, as we saw in the previous slide. And we're looking at additional data that's needed that we can collect as part of our field seasons, as part of analyzing new information with LiDAR, et cetera. This also includes looking at equipment to launch research monitoring, which is another part of our forest management planning process in the next year. Modeling. So this step involves running simulations based on the best available data that we have to inform landscape and forest land planning under an uncertain future. And so modeling will be used to power the landscape analysis for the Elliott during the forest management planning phase, and will continue to play a significant role in the long-term research on the forest. During the Elliott Research Forest proposal, we had 2015 stand level inventory data that was used to run a program called FVS. We are continuing to work with tree growth and harvest modeling, but also bringing in additional modeling, including, as we've talked about in a previous meeting, this example of Landis 2 as a landscape model, as well as additional models looking at species habitat, hydrology, and other factors. And so with landscape modeling, with Landis 2 in particular, we are able to look at forest growth using variable climate scenarios, which is not something that we have been able to do to date as part of the research proposal. And so we'll be using multiple models to inform our landscape analysis, test the potential outcomes of various treatment allocations and management scenarios, and use that information to help make decisions as part of the forest management plan about our strategies. This includes parameterizing the models for the Elliott, using data to inform the type of information that we need to gather, assessing model behavior to understand how and why a model is behaving and adjust as needed, and then use this process to identify additional data needs. And I apologize that I'm going quickly. I'm just being cognizant of time. So Peter, stop me if I'm going too fast.
No, you're not. And in fact, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here. Paul Beck had something come up and he's got to sign off here momentarily, unfortunately, and had something he wanted to share on the upcoming agenda item. And I want to give him just a second to do that before he signs off. So I'll have you actually pause here for a second.
Okay.
And then give Paul the stage, and then we'll come back to you. But I appreciate the speed. It's going well.
Yeah, I apologize. I do need to get off and run. I I've I'm beating the drum again on finances. More in the fact that we're designing this whole project, and then at the very end, we're going to figure out how much money we have. And my fear is you're going to design something that is so elaborate and so fancy and has all the whistles and bells that we want, because we want to do this research, but we're going to find out that we don't have the money. We need to move the financial analysis up, so we can know what we can actually afford, because as I've said in the past, every one of these research projects that I've seen fail is because there wasn't the money to fund it down the road. So we need to move it up. And frankly, I was a little disappointed when I asked for what you have so far. I was told that you couldn't share it with me. And if I don't have what it is you're thinking, I can't give you input on it. So apologize for having to sign off, but I really think we need to move the financials up into the process further earlier, so we know what we can afford.
So Paul, I know you have to hop off, and I appreciate that perspective on moving that timeline up on the FMP spreadsheet that I shared. And I know you won't be here for the financial analysis conversation that we're going to have later on in the meeting, and I'd be happy to follow up with you another time to walk through it with you. The financial analysis that was done as part of the research proposal includes looking at revenue projections and cost estimates, and none of those have changed. What we're doing right now is refining the information that we're inputting into that model, but we've run multiple scenarios. The scenario that I'm presenting today is a moderate scenario with some flexibility, but it is projected to be net neutral and to fully fund the research program as it's been outlined in the research proposal. But I would really appreciate the opportunity to walk through it with you and see if you have any specific areas of concern or input. And I wasn't able to share it ahead of this meeting, but I can share it with you after the meeting.
Yeah, if you can send me what you're going to present today, so I can look at it, and that way I'll have a basis for conversation. Trying to have that conversation without that basis is not going to be real productive. So anyway, apologize, I've got to get off. See y'all later.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption, and but felt like it was an important comment to get in there. So
absolutely, yeah, and I'll follow up with him after the meeting.
Great.
Okay, so looking now at bringing together those various threads that we were talking about, data, modeling, input from stakeholders, we get to this landscape analysis. And so with all of this information, what we're looking at doing is integrating the stand and watershed level allocations and management strategies into the overall forest management strategy for the Elliott, and looking at that landscape level view. And so as we work on this landscape analysis, it will involve optimizing the placement and design of treatment allocations according to multiple criteria, and some of them are listed here. This includes stand age, which was used in the initial analysis in the research proposal. And as I mentioned, we're continuing to refine and update that data. Looking at topography and steep slopes, addressing limitations and considerations of impacts from forest management activities. Looking at roads, and this was a point that was brought up at the working group meeting earlier in the month. Looking at road quality and access, where we can have forest management operations without potentially building new roads. Looking at riparian areas and continuing to look at protections, habitat structure and quality, and looking at fragmentation and avoiding fragmentation as best as we can at a watershed and landscape scale. And so models are being used to help run the landscape analysis, including ground truthing and analyzing that model behavior, as I mentioned. Within this, there are several key experiments that are outlined in the research proposal, and these will also be further detailed in the forest management plan, and they're another layer of that landscape analysis. And so I won't dig into the details too much here because I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to point out what these research experiments are. There's a restoration experiment for areas that are currently in Douglas fir plantations that are now being assigned to reserve. There is a project looking at designing a strategy for adaptive silviculture for climate change, including working with a national project that has sites in other areas of the country, but does not have one currently in the Northwest. There is a key research project looking at riparian reserve layouts and restoration treatments in both the management research watersheds and the conservation research watersheds. As I mentioned earlier, there is a 500-acre experiment outlined in the research proposal with 80% retention for marbled murrelets. And finally, looking in more detail at the silvicultural approaches for extensive treatments. And I'm happy to walk through the details of those with anyone who's interested in follow-up, and I'm sure we'll also be talking about them more in future advisory committee meetings. And so the FMP will also detail the adaptive management strategy for the Elliott, and this approach can also be applied to the allocations process that we're talking about today. And so as outlined in the research proposal, OSU plans to identify and test criteria for selection of a group of sub-watersheds for initial treatments, and then work with the adaptive management approach to evaluate feasibility and work on a phased implementation approach. And so that means starting small, not looking at the entire Elliott landscape all at once for treatments in those initial stages. As we look at the adaptive management approach as it applies to the steps we talked about today, you can see a loop that forms. So that includes conducting modeling and in-depth landscape analysis, identifying additional criteria for treatment allocations, allocating treatments within sub-watersheds. This step has already been done as part of the research proposal, but we might make some adjustments based on those additional criteria and data. Looking at our adaptive management triggers for decision-making, developing a list of criteria and outcomes, reanalyzing the landscape based on decisions at the watershed scale, and reviewing with input from stakeholders. And so all of this sort of feeds back into a landscape analysis. So that was an overview of the types of data collection, modeling, and analysis that are part of the FMP development process. And that work will also help inform the overarching management strategies for the Elliott as they're outlined in the current draft table of contents, which we have also shared. These strategies are based on the research proposal, the HCP, the forest management plan analysis, and continued input from working groups and committees. And we are, as I mentioned, also working on incorporating the feedback that we got from the working group earlier this month into that table of contents and into our next steps. So appreciate the efforts of that group. And with that, I will wrap it up. And I'm not sure if there are any questions about that forest management piece, or Peter, if you'd prefer that I do a brief overview of the engagement process and how that fits into what I just discussed.
Let's just see if there's any quick questions or comments from the committee on this. Okay. Oh yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Shannon, nice job presenting that. I guess just circling back a little bit to the conversations we had in the FMP working group on December 3rd. You know, we talked about key sections, and I think your timeline says December of 22. There'll be some draft key sections will be done. We talked about that. There's some reference in it in the notes from Jenna. I just wondered from your perspective, what do you all see as the key sections to have completed by then?
So, you know, I think I think it really aligns with what we talked about on that December 3rd meeting. So having that updated analysis with the treatment allocations and the forest management activities that are part of all of those different areas, including extensive. I think that's been a piece that there's been a lot of discussion about. And so having the details of that piece put together, as well as looking at some of the carbon and climate change work and the recreation planning. And I know that was something that several members of that subgroup from this advisory committee had brought up as well. So looking at how recreation and access dovetail with the research and the HCP that's happening on the forest.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think one of the other ones we talked about is some, more information on the design for the marble murrelet experiment as well, I think was called out. I guess my observation is I appreciate that you're thinking about those things. It'd be great to have those kind of spelled out in the draft outline so we can all see what those are and make sure we're sort of have the same expectations for that one.
Yes. And we're working on that updated draft right now and adding some more details, and we'll be recirculating that with the committee, including with any additional comments from today.
And then the other, you made reference to the table of contents, and I could see you did make some updates and additions there, and that was helpful. I guess I'd still circle back to, I think a section on natural climate solutions would be really important to add into that. So I just point that out again for your consideration. I don't know if you all talked about it or it's just on the list of things to do at this point.
Yes, I do have that on our list, and actually wanted to follow up with you about that and any resources or specific ideas you had that you would want us to consider as part of the research program. So appreciate you highlighting that, and I'll definitely be following up with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thanks. So I've got Bob Salinger and then Colin, and then we're going to briefly talk about engagement, and I need to make sure that we have enough time to get to the financials here. So pressing questions or comments we'll take. Bob and then Colin.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I think it's really tightening up and coming a lot clearer. So I really appreciate that. The only comment I would make is, I think especially that December 2022 timeline is really critical. And I think in the past we've given ourselves the luxury of, getting delayed and just extending the timeline. I don't feel like we have that anymore. So I just want to really emphasize the need that if we get behind, we're going to have to catch up in this case, as opposed to just kick it into 2023. So I think that's going to be real important to some of the groups on the call.
Thanks, Bob. Colin?
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for the presentation. I had a couple comments, questions. First was, you've talked a little bit about tweaking the watershed allocations, and I'd be interested in learning more about that, which watersheds you're looking at tweaking and what changes might be made. Kind of along those same lines, part of this proposal is to create a centralized data repository. I'm wondering what the timeline might be on that, and if it would be possible for you to share with some of the committee members some of the data that you're working with now, just basic stand data, basic inventory data, the proposed watershed allocations, things like that.
Sure. So on the question of watersheds and any of those fine scale adjustments that I was talking about that might be made, the analysis that was done on the research during the research proposal phase was really based primarily on the stand age data that we had from 2015. And so what we're doing now is bringing in some of that additional criteria for decision making. So if there are other things that need to be taken into consideration, including steep slopes and topography, as I mentioned, trying to limit fragmentation at a watershed and landscape scale, looking at habitat structure, getting updated data because in some cases, the conditions that are currently out there on the ground don't quite match up with the data that we have from 2015. And so this next process involves bringing in all of those different layers. And I think as we get further into that analysis, what we'd really like is engagement from a bunch of the different stakeholder groups that we're bringing together, the science working groups, as well as members of this committee, so that we're being transparent about the data that we're using, where it's coming from, how we're tackling these decisions and trade-offs, and getting input from people with different expertise. So that's going to be part of this next year in the forest management plan. As far as the data system, we are now working with Hans Liu, who is also working with the H.J. Andrews on their data management system. And so we've given him all of the data that we've gotten from DSL, and they got that information from ODF. And so Hans has been working on building the architecture for that public-facing database system, bringing in the information that we currently have, and then we're working with him to look at what are our additional data needs that we need to bring in. And that includes the 2021 LiDAR analysis, which I believe we should hopefully have by February. And so we'll be talking more in the new year about that data management system and sharing sort of the beta version for that with this group as it becomes available.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
And Shannon, I'm going to suggest, since we have a presentation that provides an overview of the engagements, variety of different engagement opportunities, as well as the work that the college is going to be taking on the FMP, why don't we take a very short break here and turn our attention to the financials? We'll get that information posted, if that's okay. And I don't mean to diminish the significance of that, but I want to make sure we have enough time for the financial analysis, and we can actually add it to the January agenda if needed for the advisory committee and walk through that. So why don't we take a very short break, maybe 3 minutes to get yourself a glass of water, use the restroom, and we'll convene again in 3 minutes. All right. Folks are maybe starting to make their way back. If you can indicate that you're ready to get started, that'd be helpful. Okay, it looks like folks are starting to come back. Shannon, I think we're ready to have you turn our attention to the next agenda topic. And as you get set up, I'll just remind folks, I've got a couple of people, Sue and Fergus, that from the public that are interested in commenting. Anybody else who's in members of the public that wish to make public comments, please send me or Jenna a chat, and we'll make sure to get you in the queue. And there, as a reminder, there's a full public meeting focused on this on the 21st on the financial analysis, and there'll be a greater opportunity for engagement and discussion at that point. Thanks. And with that, Shannon.
It's Barb. I wanted to make a statement at the end too. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, thanks, Barb.
Okay.
Sorry, Peter, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties. So let me just try again. I might need a minute to sort this out. My slideshow is not working.
All right, no problem. I wonder, Paul Odenthal, not to put you on the spot, I wondered if, maybe while Shannon gets set up here, if you want to speak briefly to the work that the university conducted by way of context for today's presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And Shannon will go through quite a bit of this as she gets it up. But we've had back from the initial analysis that was done as part of the research proposal. Part of my role with this is I brought in a team across the university from the Department of Finance and Administration to work with the College of Forestry to sound out a lot of the items in this, what you're going to see today in the budget model, and to try and ground truth them as well and make sure that we feel we have a sustainable product to deliver here for the life of this agency as well. So, a couple of key factors I will say in this as well as Shannon talks through it is to understand it is a budget model, right? There's a lot of assumptions that are made in this and a lot of things we don't know as we go forward. More that will become known as the forest management plan is completed. But also we're talking about 50 years of effort here as well. Also, I would say we've really this captures what we see from the university side on costs. There is some of the administrative overhead in here as well. However, not knowing where the ESRF authority lands and what the complete burden of that will be as well, that's really not part of this presentation, and it's a piece that will need to be considered as the legislation gets completed as well.
Thanks, Paul. And Shannon, you're up and ready.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so as Paul said, today we'd like to walk through the financial analysis that OSU has done for the Elliott State Research Forest, and this is our budget model as of today. And so an outline of what we'd like to talk about today, we have a brief introduction looking at the revenue assumptions that went into this budget model. our estimated annual expenditures for the Elliott once it is up and running as a research forest, and then taking a step back to look at the projected startup costs to get us to that long-term set of annual expenditures and revenues. And then finally wrapping up with, again, a reminder of the overall budget model assumptions for this model that we have right now. Okay, so this financial analysis is OSU's current assessment of operation and research costs tailored to a revenue model that's based on the anticipated harvest volumes outlined in the OSU research proposal as it was approved in December 2020. Harvests are used to implement the experimental design, and they're not done solely to drive revenue. The numbers in this analysis are estimates that will continue to be refined based on several factors, including what I just spoke about as part of the forest management planning process, as well as details related to the governance structure and infrastructure, as Paul alluded to. The requested startup funds were estimated by experts from OSU and other institutions and were included as part of the research proposal. This budget does not account for factors outside of Oregon State University's control, including the new pending ownership structure of the Elliott State Research Forest public entity. And we'll be able to update that analysis once we have a better idea of what that entity structure and needs are. This budget model and anticipated startup funds are subject to change based on new information and refinement of the plans for sub-watersheds from the research proposal. And as we discussed in the presentation on the FMP timeline and process, integrating that new information into this financial analysis is folded into the FMP timeline. As we pointed out, that work is really at this point planned to begin in earnest in the summer as we have these details really coming together more, but that doesn't mean that we're waiting for the summer. And the feedback that we got today is we might want to look at that timeline even more closely. And so we'll be following up on that. So first, to look at revenue assumptions. OSU during the research proposal phase hired Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. MBG is a natural resource consulting firm that has been in business since 1921. They are multidisciplinary leaders working with both private and public forestry sectors in our region. And so we worked with them to provide data and input, and they ran the analysis for these revenue models. Income projections were done by MBG based on existing inventory and harvest projections in the OSU research proposal. New data is being collected and incorporated into the analysis during the FMP process, as I mentioned, along with additional criteria for decision-making. According to MBG's financial analysis of the projected 50-year cash flow of net timber revenue, which is what you can see right here, the estimates from their analysis are between $5.4 million and $6.1 million annually. And so you see here at the bottom, these are 5-year time periods, and this is the 50-year projection based on their analysis. And we'll be returning to this figure a little bit later on in the presentation today. So this sub-watershed should look familiar. This is the example that we used when talking about the forest management plan timeline. And again, this is a triad I allocation with a set of reserves, extensive and intensive, as well as riparian conservation areas. And the allocations that you see here were based on the initial analysis done in that research proposal. And this is the information that was used to drive the modeling and financial analysis that was done by Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. The big picture, the research design and the FMP determines where, when, and how the harvests occur. But this level of detail is really what went into that analysis. So zooming out to the landscape scale, this is a decision tree that was used by MBG for allocating treatments used in their analysis. And this is for the extensive treatments. So just to give you a little bit of a closer look at what went into their calculations. Intensive stands are in areas that are less than 65 years old in 2020, and are handled separately. So really, I just want to highlight that this focuses on the decision tree for these extensive treatments and how they fit into that analysis. And so you can see here, there's a separate area over here for stands that were greater than 65 years old in 2020, and a separate area over here for stands that were less than 65 years old. And so for stands that are greater than 65, the allocations were based first on whether an area has designated marbled murrelet or northern spotted owl habitat. If yes, this went into a high retention for extensive in the model. If no, then it went down and looked at relative density for that stand to determine whether it would fit into a moderate retention or low retention. And similar here for the less than 65 for high, moderate, and low retention. So this is the decision-making process that went into that analysis. As I've said, we are now at this stage refining some of that information. And so that refinement at the stand and watershed level will be used to update the financial analysis and revenue projections. Now let's look at the estimated annual harvest per treatment per category for year. And note that these estimates and timings of harvest may change with more information. So I just wanted to point that out from the beginning. The graph on the left is the current estimate of acres harvested across all allocations. And this is, again, based on 5-year time periods down here at the bottom. I know it might be a little difficult to see. The model shows a maximum of approximately 1,300 acres per year being harvested in the first 5 years. And you'll see that here outlined in the red. And a couple of pieces to point out here. You can see that this is a mixture of intensive. So there's intensive regeneration in the dark blue, intensive thinning in the white and blue, extensive in the green and white, and reserve thinnings in black. And so what you'll notice here is in the first 20 years, there are some reserve thinnings happening. And this refers to that key research experiment that I discussed very briefly in the forest management planning presentation, where we're looking at areas that are currently Douglas fir plantations that are now being moved into a reserve structure. And so this relates to any thinnings that would need to be done in those areas to help move that process forward. And that's going to be outlined in the forest management plan. Once of the restoration and the bulk of the thinning occurs, you'll see that the annual acres harvested drops considerably, as low as 500 acres per year. As I mentioned, the black bars indicate the reserve thinnings in the Douglas fir plantations. Thinnings of plantations and reserves would happen, of course, in these first 20 years, and then the greater acreage of harvest and extensive during the first 20 years compared to what we see moving forward are due in part to planned thinnings that would help transition Douglas fir plantations to more complex stand structures and promote trees that are more wind firm and capable of surviving and thriving in those longer rotations. The graph on the right shows the projected annual harvest volume in million board feet per year. You'll see slight variations across the 5-year periods here, but the projection is for an average of approximately 17 million board feet annually across all of these treatment types. And as is laid out in the research proposal, this equates to approximately 1% of the forest per year. And apologies for the dog. So now taking a closer look at that graph that was on the right, annual revenue projections across all treatments based on the average 17 million board feet. The red line at the top is projected gross revenue. And this is a number from, or a line from Mason, Bruce, and Gerard as part of their analysis. The bar graph shows net revenue projections. And if we were to take that black line from the first slide that shows $5.4 to $6.1 million annual revenue, that line would rest right on top of this bar graph right here. That was just for the first 50 years we were showing that snapshot. This is, of course, a much longer time horizon as part of their analysis. And so when we look at the difference between the net and gross, some of the harvest expenses that Mason, Bruce, and Gerard included in their calculations were silvicultural costs, including site preparation, any planting that would need to be done in certain areas of the forest, as well as pre-commercial thinning, work related to animal damage, any road costs and hauling costs, as well as logging costs. And so that was all included here in this analysis. I might just pause there to see if there are any questions on the revenue projections for Mason, Bruce, and Gerard and the assumptions that went into those analyses.
Shannon, just a clarification maybe, or a question, I'm not sure, but I thought the thinning in the reserves, at least in the proposal, was outlined for the first 5 years as opposed to the first 20 years here.
Oops, sorry, I was trying to go back. I believe this is according to the research proposal. So it's up to the first 20 years, but we are detailing that as part of the forest management plan. So if there are any refinements to that, this is the time when that would happen. But according to the research proposal, it's up to 20 years. And that's primarily because not all of that would, thinning would occur at once. It would be spaced out over time.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions, comments? All right, go ahead, Shannon.
Okay. So next, we'd like to look at estimated annual expenditures and the annual budget model for the Elliott, including projected costs. And as we mentioned in the beginning, this is based on OSU's estimates currently and does not necessarily include any changes that might be coming with the new public entity or other factors. So this is OSU's estimate of the average annual expenses associated with operating the research and management program on the Elliott. We ran multiple long-term budget scenarios, and these models show financial sustainability of the forest for at least 50 years, the length of the model period. The numbers shown here are from the moderate scenario, which is designed to be net neutral. There is flexibility to add or reduce costs to accommodate uncertainties in this budget model. And as I mentioned earlier, the continued refinement of these numbers is part of the FMP process. And so just taking a closer look at some of these line items, the personnel in this budget estimate, as I mentioned, are based on our moderate budget scenario. For the operations personnel, this would include 7 full-time employees once the research forest is fully up and running. And so in our analysis, this includes a lead forester, administrative support, GIS and inventory expertise, a forest engineer, business log accounting, a forestry technician, and an additional forester to work with that lead forester. For the research personnel, we have a total of 11 FTE, and that would include the executive director, a communication specialist, data specialist, 3 professorial tenure track research faculty with specialties in physical, biological, and social sciences, as well as 4 research technicians, 3 graduate assistants, and then several student interns. And so those are the personnel that are included in this model. As we'll talk about in a little bit, there is a startup analysis that's part of this. And so these personnel, as I mentioned, are once the forest is fully up and running, and the personnel during the startup phase looks a little bit different. So we'll dig into that shortly. We have a line item for operating equipment based on information from OSU Research Forest estimates. You'll see here a line item for ODF wildfire protection assessment at $4 per acre. And this is through ODF Space Protection Program delivered through the local forest protection districts. We have an operations working budget here, including road maintenance and upkeep. You'll see a line item here for HCP monitoring for additional expenses associated with monitoring under the HCP for effectiveness. Office and facilities here is, this is the annual upkeep and maintenance costs, as well as any rent or lease that may need to be paid while a facility is built. And I will note, we'll dig into this a little bit further. These numbers are based on new construction. As Vicki mentioned, we're going to be touring Shutter Creek tomorrow, and that has come up as a possible facility that could be used for the research forest. And in that case, we would be looking at renovation costs, not costs for building and maintaining a new facility. And so that's another area where we would be able to refine this analysis with more information. You'll see variable research monitoring costs here for supplies, equipment, maintenance and logistics, as well as data storage management and quality control. And this is part of our data management plan that Hans is working on. There's a vehicle maintenance budget annually, and right now in our budget model, we have projected 15 vehicles related to the research and operations of the forest. You'll see OSU overhead here, and this is 3% of expenses. And again, depending on the structure of the public entity, we may need to revisit this line. And then you have a contingency fund here that would, under this model, be projected to have $550,000 put into that model annually starting in year 5. That would build up so that there is a contingency fund to deal with any uncertainties that may arise with the management of the forest. So as we saw earlier, modeled expenses are approximately $5.45 million per year, and revenues from timber harvest under the experimental design for Mason, Bruce, and Gerard's analysis are $5.4 to $6.1 million. When we chart this out, we see that that the forest, as it's currently modeled, achieves long-term sustainability. This is based on timber harvests that are part of the experimental design and does not account for other potential sources of funding that would potentially be available to help complement operations revenue, including grants, contracts, in-kind contributions from agencies, partners, or other collaborators. And so that would be an additional piece. You can see here that harvest revenue does not exist until year 4, and operations personnel and most research personnel are hired during the first year, but not at the full staffing levels that we have for our annual operations budget. This also includes $820,000 over the first 5 years for supporting existing expertise. So this means basically 1 FTE over the course of about 60 months that we would be able to use to bring in specialized help, people who have specific expertise to help, for example, ramping up the monitoring program on the forest, installing equipment, and that sort of work during this first time period here. And so that's included in the analysis. So as we can see, this forest is as I said, projected to achieve long-term sustainability under the current revenue and cost projections that we have. Years 1 through 3 are supported by startup costs. And in our current model, we have startup costs estimated at $35 million to get to this self-sustaining point once we have revenue coming in from the forest management activities. And maybe I'll pause there and see if there are additional questions on the annual budget model for costs before we dig into the startup.
Yeah, Eric? And then
That was going to
Colin.
be my question was on startup, so I'll stand by.
Okay, Colin?
I have 2 questions, one on revenues and one on costs. I was just doing some quick, scratching out some quick math, looking at the harvest acres and volumes and expected revenues. And it looks like you're estimating stumpage at around 580, 590, 1,000 board feet. And to me, that seems pretty optimistic, given that a lot of this volume is going to become from retention harvest in the extensive areas, as well as thinnings in the reserve areas. And I was just wondering if you could share some of the cost assumptions that Mason, Bruce, and Gerard used in coming up with those numbers. And the second question I had is, looking at the costs, I see some things that are missing: road maintenance, reforestation and stand development, including planting, vegetation management, invasive species control, pre-commercial thinning, those sort of things. I'm wondering if those are wrapped into that stumpage rate, and if so, that makes that stumpage rate seem even more optimistic. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I guess to start with your second question first, all of that was wrapped into the stumpage rates from Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. And I can sort of share the calculations or the information that we have from them about how they addressed those different factors in their analyses. I know that they worked with one of our researchers at OSU to do the harvest scheduling, to look at the information that we have on stand age based on that 2015 inventory data, and then model that, project that out, and then apply the information from the research proposal about the rotation lengths that we have for intensive versus extensive, retention, looking at incorporating thinnings. And then they also looked at cable logging versus ground logging costs as well. And so that's sort of the level of detail that they looked at for growing the forest out, and then applying the types of management scenarios that would happen according to what we have outlined in the research proposal. That's another area where, of course, we're going to be continuing to refine during the forest management plan. But I think it would be really helpful to follow up with you and any others on specific pieces to make sure that we're incorporating them into that analysis. And I can also share with you, I can follow up with you on how MBG incorporated them into their analysis.
Great, thanks. I'll follow up via email.
Great.
Sorry, we had one other question that came through chat, and Jeff, I wondered if you wanted to address it related to the cost of the authority in general.
Yeah, I can take a whack at it. I guess I'd start out by saying that I think that there has been a lot of work around good work by OSU around what it costs to operate a forest based on experience, and has been wrapped into some of these projections around operations and maintenance and things like that. So the starting point is that my understanding is that the modeling is looking at the long-term capacity of the forest to balance the books on an annual basis by managing the forest with based on the expectations that they can predict today. And Paul's rightfully being cautious that if the legislation layers on a bunch of things that are unexpected, that could change. But that it's not that the operational costs of running the Elliott State Research Forest have not been accounted for in the revenue or in this modeling. So that's at least my understanding going into it. So that leaves us then with what is the startup cost to stand this forest up so that it gets to the point where it's self-sustaining going forward. And we are looking at a different funding sources. So we've got to do the decoupling, and we've got startup costs that have to be dealt with. And we have an estimate on the startup costs that we'll refine over time. There are state funds available to us. We are actively pursuing different sources of federal funds, and there's always the potential and of looking into the potential for sale of carbon credits, all that can be in the mix of revenue sources to get the forest stood up until it's self-supporting on the long term. So I think that's the general answer to the question. It's not expected that there would be a biennial budget associated with a legislative request for funding to support the forest on an ongoing basis. That's not built into this model or an assumption that would be necessary. It's just the opposite of trying to avoid that. And that's been kind of the predicate for the conversation from the beginning. So we are working on, and we're aware of the startup costs, and we're working closely with OSU on that. And we've got a bunch of different threads, but you won't see that called out specifically in a legislative concept bill in February. The decoupling is up first as the primary objective for the financial component in February. Did that help clarify it a little bit? Is there a follow-up on that, Peter or Paul?
Yeah, I'll just say, I kind of echo what Jeff is saying. So for instance, Shannon mentioned the executive director cost is in here. It's in part of that research personnel as well. So those costs that we know, items that are part of the forest, whether it was owned by OSU or within this authority, they are in our numbers as well. There is still, like Jeff said, is there unanticipated costs that will arise through the legislation? That's still a concern out there as that gets formulated as well. But we do feel, we have that, looking at that $500,000 of contingency building every year as well, which is a nice pot of money to help us maintain this as we hit things that are unknown in our work forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the jobs of the board when this is stood up will be to work with OSU to make the adjustments in the budgeting process so that on an annual basis everybody's comfortable that the forest can be run and what's supposed to happen can happen based on the reality of what's happening on the ground. And then we'll do our best to have different sources of funds that can supplement in, but without an ongoing expectation for a legislatively approved budget for the forest from general funds or something like that on an ongoing basis. There's my dog.
Working from home. All right, great. Shannon, you can continue with the startup costs.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now looking at startup costs. So currently startup costs are estimated at $35 million. You can see this signified by the yellow star here in year 1. And then the startup funds are used in years 1 through 3 here in the blue stars to support the early costs of the research forest before the Elliott is able to generate revenue, as we discussed. And so, and once again, harvest income is projected to come in year 4. As we mentioned, operations personnel and most research personnel are hired during that first year. So let's take a closer look at those estimated startup costs and what's been included in the analysis. This is part of the December 2020 research proposal. And so that startup request includes $17 million for infrastructure and research station, general startup support that includes $10 million in working capital, and then funds to purchase vehicles, as well as $7.3 million for research plots and inventory and monitoring instrumentation of the forest that contributes both to the data collection and monitoring for the Elliott State Research Forest. We'll take a closer look at what went into the estimates for infrastructure, working capital, and an example of one of the research monitoring programs. And there are similar detailed estimates of the monitoring and research infrastructure needs for the other main areas of monitoring that are outlined here as well. The research plots and inventory, this line item, is based on aerial and ground-based LiDAR, aerial photography, and either permanent or temporary plot installation on the forest. And so just one note before we look at the details, the carbon and climate monitoring line item here, these are expenses related to the research monitoring program, not any inventory or monitoring needs that would be related to carbon credits. So just wanted to highlight that. So looking at estimated infrastructure startup costs, and again, these were based on a new build, and we have since had other potential infrastructure options come forward, and we're looking at those now. And so this is one area where our projections may change. So these are based on estimates for construction using square footage estimates for office space, research, living, and educational space. The infrastructure costs can be variable based on size, scope, and quality of a new research facility. And so this estimate is based on investigating comparable research stations and in consultation with Libby Ramirez, who is the OSU lead architect and was helpful with square footage estimates currently. In addition to investigating new construction versus renovation costs, if Shutter Creek is a good option, cost estimates can also be refined by drafting plans for the amount and type of space required to carry out the research program and related to educational programming. So you can see here, there's educational space included. There is a bunkhouse that would be available for researchers or educational programs who would need to stay overnight, as well as a fully functioning kitchen to support the people who would be here on the research forest. Looking at working capital startup costs, this shows working capital costs for the first 3 years based on personnel and operations. And just a note, again, that the personnel on the startup years are lower than the additional capacity that's added once the forest has the additional revenue coming in. And so there's 6 FTE here for the operations personnel, 7 once the forest is fully up and running, and 9 FTE in the beginning versus 11 once the forest is fully up and running. And then again, working capital startup costs align with the moderate budget scenario for the operations and research support expenses. So that aligns with the annual projections that we have as well. The research proposal identifies 4 high priority research areas, and those areas are here: carbon and climate monitoring, aquatic and riparian monitoring, wildlife and biodiversity, and social science and recreation monitoring. We'll take a closer look at one of these categories, the carbon and climate monitoring, as an example, and just take a closer deep dive into that. So this is an example of the research startup costs, and these numbers were generated based on input from researchers whose area of expertise is in climate and carbon from OSU. And so what you see here in the line items for this research program are installing climate stations, which would measure temperature, precipitation, relative humidity, soil moisture, and radiation. We have a line item here for soil pits, and you'll see here some of these are priced per unit, and then a single watershed, and then at the full scale, and others are just at a landscape scale. And so for the climate stations here, this is $160,000 for 16 climate stations that would be spread out across the forest, plus an additional $40,000 for equipment to do slope transects and additional monitoring within the watersheds as needed. You'll see here additional lab equipment too, which would be housed at the research facility, carbon nitrogen analyzer and drying ovens, as well as looking at canopy and soil monitoring using 6 climate towers, as well as additional equipment. And so what do these funds actually buy in terms of research? This is an example from the H.J. Andrews of the type of data that they have in their data management system that's fully accessible. So the research program at the Elliott and the information that would be available are across a broad range, but a couple of the areas that we're really excited about are the ability to provide real-time data. This is an example of real-time data on stream carbon from the H.J. Andrews that anyone can access through their database management system, as well as historic data from decades, across decades from long-term monitoring. And this type of data can be incredibly useful in looking at historic trends, as well as being used for models to look at projected future conditions. And as part of the Elliott, we'll be making similar measurements to those shown here on trees in reserves and across a range of active management scenarios from intensive to extensive. And so this is just a small snapshot of the type of information that will be generated as part of the research program. And so to close, before we get into any additional questions, I just wanted to review the assumptions that have gone into this budget model. As we've discussed, the data that has gone into the analysis is also being refined. The public entity costs are not considered in this budget model due to lack of certainty on the structure of the entity as of this assessment, but the costs associated with running the research for us, and as was pointed out, including having the executive director on board, are included in this model. Startup costs related to infrastructure are subject to change based on the ultimate size and scope of the research facility and whether Shutter Creek is a potential facility that could be renovated rather than us doing new construction. Cost estimates and revenue projections are subject to refinement during the forest management plan process and all of the steps that I outlined earlier. And finally, this budget model is based on the assumption that forest operations begin in fiscal year 24. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any additional questions, and I'm happy to go back to specific slides if that's helpful too.
Great, we'll start with Eric, I believe. Yeah.
Quick question on research funding. So are we anticipating that the project as it's outlined right now is paid for, is self-sufficient and it's taking care of it, and there's no other research grants or funding coming in to handle operations or day-to-day stuff?
Yes, that's correct. So this budget analysis only looks at harvest revenue generated under that experimental design. It doesn't account for any additional sources of revenue that may also come into the forest.
I also just wanted to chime in that the revenue or the projections that we have for the backbone of the research, and that we fully anticipate that other people will take advantage of that backbone by writing grants and doing work there, because it's exactly the model that the H.J. Andrews works under, and it's very successful. And so it's it's not intended that every research question will be funded by this revenue stream. It's the backbone that's funded.
Yes, thank you for that clarification on that, Katie. Yes, we fully anticipate that there will be additional revenue to support the research activities, but it's not included in this budget. So this is really just the functioning of that, as Katie said, that research backbone of the forest. And in that sense, it's, you know, a little bit conservative. We are anticipating that there will be additional funds coming in to support that research program.
Thanks, Katie, Shannon, and thanks for the question, Eric. Any other comments or questions from the committee? Okay. Must have done a great job, Shannon.
If any other questions do come up, please don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to dig into the details with you more. And as we do continue to refine this budget analysis with more information over the next year, we will be providing updates as well.
Thanks. With that, I have 3, maybe 4 members of the public that would like to make comments, and then we'll save a couple of minutes for next steps and wrapping before we adjourn no later than noon. I have Sue, Craig, Fergus, Barb, and Peggy. Sue, you can go ahead and go first.
Okay, thank you all, especially Shannon, for all this work. May I ask a very personal question of you, Shannon? Who pays for you to do this? Are you in the Department of Forestry at OSU?
Yes, so I am in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, and I'm my position right now is funded through the agreement with DSL and OSU as part of the funds for this forest management plan process.
Okay, thank you. And your background is as a forester?
Yes, I've worked in forestry and natural resource management.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue. Fergus.
To estimate carbon in a forest, use a conversion factor between 2 and 10 tons per 1,000 board feet. Let's say Elliott carbon runs around 4 tons. With 50,000 board feet on 50,000 acres, that's about 10 million tons of carbon on reserves. So at $10 a ton, that's about $100 million worth of carbon, with annual increment around 2.5 million. Oregon State University is advising the land board to sell the Elliott to a new state agency they want to set up. So the school fund receives $221 million for 80,000 acres with maybe 150 million of standing timber. And with $100 million worth of carbon thrown in for free. Now that does not sound like a very good deal for the school fund. It gets you wondering why Oregon State University is so tight-lipped about the value of the Elliott's carbon. Poking around on the internet, I learned that on European markets since Glasgow, carbon credit futures jumped more than 50%. On December 9th, according to Bloomberg, they hit 88 euros. That's $100.30 per ton. At that price, the Elliott's carbon is worth $1 billion with an annual increment of $25 million, and very possibly much higher by the end of next year. Yet Oregon State University is advising the land board to sell the forest at a price tag that doesn't value carbon at all. Since the land board's fiduciary obligation as Elliott trustee supersedes political pressure to close the Elliott sale in the short session, I would caution my good friend, Director Walker, not to be too quick at passing Oregon State University's advice on to the land board without a thorough, up-to-date audit of the Elliott's value, including carbon, from at least 2 competent, experienced, and objective third parties. Thank you and good luck.
Thanks, Fergus. Up next, we have Barb.
Hi, it's Barb down here on the river. So yes, I want to Fergus, what you just said, that's it, 100,000%. You got it, brother. And my concern is that the 34,000 acres are blocked. However, I still see some loophole logging in there, and then the another 14,000 acres are being looked at separately, and I see loophole logging in there, and then I see the cap of 3,400 acres on a harvest of trees older than 65. I see lots of loophole logging here. I don't see any real, I mean, I want to say that I see it. I think you guys are doing exemplary work, and I want to thank you so much for being open to other funding and looking at the feds. And I particularly would like to hammer the NOAA reserve, and also the excellent idea of the man that spoke earlier about this devil's staircase and the Soyuz law to protect the Elliott in perpetuity forever. Because in 5 or 10 years, like the timber industry and the agencies always do, you know, they come in, and in a 60-year plan, they come in 10 years, 11 years into a 60-year plan, they come in and they want to change everything and they want to do some more. Well, guess what? We can't do it anymore like that. So here's the deal. We don't want any more loophole logging. We don't want to create any more refugee species, because you can't kill them with an ITP written within your HCP. You just can't do it and expect Oregonians to stand behind this. So let's get this done for once and for all. Again, good work. Paul Beck and I do agree on exactly one thing, and that is stabilization of funding. So I encourage you desperately to seek NOAA federal funding as a research reserve within the Elliott of all the older stands in the 65 and older age, and all of the native stands that have not been touched. Because when you start messing around with stands and you think the birds are just going to be okay with that, no, they're going to leave. You're going to create refugee species. They're going to die, on and on. So I just encourage you to do the right thing and get as much money as you can to save as many old trees as you can, you know, and get Oregonians on board. And I would be happy to launch a campaign, a fundraising campaign. Sam Schwartz suggested years ago, he worked with a couple of years ago, he worked on your recreation component. He did a presentation to you guys. He's down here working as we speak on all of these things. And he suggested, how about every school child buy a tree and pay $1 and save the old trees and fund our carbon reserves for the good of the planet, because as we all know, the Pacific Northwest harbors 1/3 of its global reserves. So until we get on board with the carbon plan, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. But I do really want to wrap this up, and I know the governor wants to wrap it up, and you guys are amazing. So good luck with it, and let us know what we can do to help. Save the planet, carbon reserve. Thank you.
Thanks, Barb.
Yep.
And Peggy Lynch.
Thank you. Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon. I will ask most of my financial questions. Thank you for this presentation, by the way, at the December 21st meeting. But I do want to put a couple of things on the record. OSU just said that they have not calculated the cost of the authority. And so the authority, by creating this board and having, one would presume they will need at least one staff member to help with the working with the board, particularly since they're supposed to meet every 2 months. So that will be one question that we need to have an answer to. And the second one is, when's the start date? We have a startup cost of about 35 million, but when is that calculated? And I did not really understand or hear that answer. Thanks all of you for your time again and your expertise. I really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thanks, Peggy. As we begin to get close to the conclusion of the meeting, I want to offer an opportunity to any members of the project team or advisory committee, any closing reflections or thoughts or responses to quick questions that might be addressed here, knowing that we also have the opportunity for much more discussion on the 21st.
This is Vicki. I couldn't find out where the hand thing is. So I appreciated all the public comments today, and I did want to let Fergus know that we are getting an update on the evaluation of the potential value of carbon credits. So we're not leaving that in the dust. we are moving forward on getting that valuation. So that's been important to me, and it's been important to the governor and the land board. And I think that this committee is finding that an important issue in terms of evaluating this proposal.
Thanks, Vicki. With that, just a few quick next steps. There was a lot of discussion early in the meeting about the legislative concept and turning that into legislative language and the work that's going to go into that in January. So I think what I heard is fasten your seatbelts, and what I would request is everybody be paying attention to opportunities to weigh in and to respond quickly. We'll get some meetings on the calendar of the work group to engage directly in that. So stay tuned for polling for that. And then in early next year, rather than yet this week, but I think in early January, what we'll do is also try to schedule out the advisory committee meetings. Some of them we already in January we have, but we'll need to put some additional thought into the right cadence of meetings for the advisory committee, knowing the legislative session as well as the work that's going to go into FMP development, which may in many cases be best accomplished on the ground or looking at a series of maps and et cetera. And we want to really orient the work of the committee and the OSU team around sort of product development. And we'll try to use, as always, your time as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we'll get meetings as possible and as appropriate scheduled as far in advance as we can. With that said, just a quick reminder, 21st, Anna just put it in the chat, 21st, 5:30 to 7. There's a link there. It'll also be up on the DSL website and OSU websites if you're interested in joining for the public meeting focused on financial analysis. Thanks everybody for your time, and have a happy holiday.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.